The other thing as biologists is that depending on the types of questions that we're asking, we can study biology at a really wide-ranging set of levels. So there's organization to the way that we divvy up life on Earth. And everything really starts off in the biggest, broadest sense as the biosphere. It's the Earth as a whole. So when I look at the globe and I talk about just the living things on that earth as a whole, we talk about your biosphere. We can then divvy up that biosphere into individual biomes. So am I talking about the types of climates and types of organisms that would live in the desert biomes on Earth, and comparing that to the types of organisms I might find in tropical rainforests as opposed to coral reefs in the ocean, right? Those are different biomes. So those are these big, broad categories of the types of climates, types of soils, types of amounts of water that we might see, the types of organisms, at least in terms of the roles that they play in their ecosystems, would fall within. And then the ecosystems do fall below that. So if I'm talking about desert biomes, I may be describing things like really dry conditions. So there's not a lot of water. It tends to be very warm. You have a lot of plant life that has to be able to conserve a lot of water because there's not a lot of rainfall. That's what we're talking about as a desert biome globally. But then I can narrow down and talk about a specific desert ecosystem, something like a desert in Arizona or the Sahara Desert in Africa, and narrow down and zero in on a very specific type of desert, in which case then I would label that as an ecosystem. Everything from ecosystem, biome, and biosphere, I'm concerned as a biologist both with the living things that exist there as well as the non-living things. So the climate, the air, the soil is also part of the living life that exists there. And so I'm concerned about those interactions between life and the abiotic or the non-living components of that ecosystem or that environment. Once I get down to community levels for studying biology, then I'm really focusing just on the individual organisms. And when I look at communities, I'm talking about multiple different types of organisms in that ecosystem. So if we were to go outside into the courtyard, right, and I look at communities out there, we're talking about the grass, the trees, the different types of insects, the squirrels, the birds, right? All different types of organisms in that environment. That's what makes up or constitutes a community. Population then is a little bit more specific. Now I want to talk specifically about the squirrel population, right? I'm narrowing down on a very specific type of organism that I'm going to study in a population. It's just one type of organism. And then if I want to study individual organisms within that population, a single living thing, you are an individual organism living as part of the population of humans, which is part of the community of all the other living things that exist around here, the deer, the squirrels, the birds, the plants, right? But I can even break you down into smaller pieces to study. So you are made up of different organ systems. So your respiratory system, which is how you breathe, your circulatory system, which is how your heart pumps and your blood flows through your body, your nervous system, which includes your brain and how your brain tells the rest of your body how to do things. And those organ systems then are made up of individual organs that have very specific jobs to make sure that those systems work, so that those systems can work together to make sure you work. So if I look at your circulatory system, for example, you've got arteries and veins and capillaries, which are all those little channels through which blood flows, and blood could be considered an organ. Your heart, how does it pump all that blood around your body, right? Those are individual organs that then work together to make your circulatory system work so that you can function as an organism. Below those organs are tissues. All right, so individual groupings of cells that do a similar job but are now specific to a organ. So if I take your heart again and I break that down into individual tissues, I can talk about the muscle tissue. I can talk about the blood that flows through that heart. Those are all tissues. I can talk about connective tissue and how those different pieces get held together. We can talk about connective or conducting tissue. How does your brain actually send electrical signals to your heart? Those electrical signals go to conductive tissue in your heart and actually pump, right, and send those electrical signals. So those tissues really are then a combination of a bunch of cells working together to do a specific job. So go back to that cardiac muscle tissue. That's made up of individual muscle cells, each of which are doing their job to make sure the whole tissue works. Those tissues work together to make sure the organ works. The organs work together to make sure the organ systems work, so on and so forth. Now, once I get down to that level of a cell, that's the smallest unit of living things. So if you cycle back to the characteristics of life we were just talking about on the previous slide, your cell is the smallest thing on Earth that retains all of those characteristics. Once I start breaking down the cell into smaller pieces, and we're going to see that that is possible here, we start losing some of those characteristics. So cells are the smallest unit of living things. But they do have smaller pieces, and as biologists, we want to study those smaller pieces to understand how those bigger cells work so that we can see how they work in all the levels above them. So your cells are made up of individual organelles. Maybe you've heard of mitochondria or a nucleus or ribosomes. Those are all small specialized pieces within a cell that have a specific job, and they function collectively to make sure the cell works. So they're kind of like analogous to organs in a human, but organs in a cell. So they're subcellular organs, which is where that term organelle actually comes from. And if you look at it, right, you can see that term organ kind of in there. But we can break organelles down even smaller into things like molecules and compounds. Okay, so water is a compound, proteins are compounds, carbohydrates are compounds, and those all work together in those organelles not only to help them structurally, but also to give them some function as well. We can break down those compounds into smaller pieces called atoms or elements, okay? And each individual hydrogen atom or oxygen atom then combines into that water, for example. And even those atoms have smaller particles, your protons, your neutrons, and your electrons. Big important thing to remember here is that all of these levels, regardless of which question a biologist might be asking, although they may zero in and focus on a very particular level, they can't lose sight of the fact that what's going on below that level and above that level still impacts the level that they are studying. And the same thing goes with if something happens in an organism or in an ecosystem. If we were to take out a bunch of heart cells, right, that is absolutely going to ultimately affect that organism and its ability to function. If I start taking out populations and causing them to go extinct, vanish from Earth, that's going to affect everything else above it. So all of this is very, very much interconnected and interrelated to each other in order to make everything function as it should.
So let's go through a little bit more depth, right? So biosphere, this is the biggest level at which I can study life, and I'm talking about the entire planet or parts of the planet that are ultimately inhabited by living things. So we can talk about terrestrial parts of our biosphere, aka the land, in which these organisms live on, feed on, live in. Or we can talk about aquatic and talk about the bodies of water, so things like lakes, ponds, the ocean, etc. If I'm studying the biosphere as a whole, this is typically going to mean that I'm a scientist who's going to need to gather my data from space. And with satellite technology, it makes it really useful because I can take these pictures, I can get this data from space. Things like maybe I'm studying the amount of photosynthesis that's going on in forests on the continent and how is that changing over time. Well, I might look at satellite imagery and look at these dark regions, assume they're forests on the continent, and so I can sort of map out what percentage maybe of the total biosphere is made up of these forests. Maybe that's some data that's useful for a question that I'm asking. We go even smaller, right, and that biome then is the division of the biosphere itself, right? So things like your tundras, your deserts, your forests, your savannas. Okay, where an ecosystem, remember I just mentioned before, is a little more specific. So let's just say the biome as a whole are these deserts. An ecosystem then might be a very specific desert itself. So something like the Sahara in Africa, for example. And an ecosystem is taking the community of all these living things along with all of those non-living features. So it's not just the living organisms, but the water, the soil, the rocks, the climate, all of those things that then ultimately support that living community itself. So it's biotic plus abiotic. And your ecosystems can really vary in and of themselves, right? They can be terrestrial, like your deserts, your rainforests, your grasslands. But we often forget that ecosystems also exist in aquatic environments as well, and typically we'll split those guys out in freshwater, so things like lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, versus the oceanic ecosystems we're going to see, which in and of itself is also very widely diverse, from coral reefs to organisms who live in intertidal zones to organisms who live out in the open ocean. And the abiotic factors that contribute to their life will also be different based on where those organisms are found. The combination, though, of all those ecosystems or biomes ultimately makes up our biosphere, so that's sort of where that piece fits in. We go down to organisms, and remember this is another word for a living thing, and we're going to try to use the term organism more this year as we continue to expand our biological vocabulary. And we consider things like plants, animals, bacteria. These are all organisms, and we can get more specific within each category. You are an organism. You are a living thing. You fit all the criteria of what it means to be a living organism. Some of them are very small, like the strep bacteria that you see in the picture, in which case you may hear them called microorganisms. So these are typically things that we need a microscope to see, but they are living and meet all of those criteria, all of those characteristics in and of themselves. And keep in mind that the interactions of those organisms ultimately makes every ecosystem that they live in dynamic. The biotic processes that are going on because of these living organisms does impact the abiotic material. Usage of water because of a tree, or grass stopping mudslides, things like that. Those are going to make a difference in how those ecosystems function. And removing organisms from those ecosystems also has an impact on the abiotic side as well. And then we can break you down even further. So multicellular organisms then also have their own levels of internal organization. The cells being the smallest at which we can talk about still retaining all of those characteristics of life. But tissues that then work together, something like the cardiac muscle that you see here, being made up of cardiac muscle cells, those working together as part of an organ, in this case the heart, and then that heart being part of your cardiovascular system, along with things like your arteries and veins to make sure that material is capable of moving around your body. Cells. So this is the smallest unit of structure and function for a living thing. If I break down a cell any further, which of course I can, there's building pieces for it, but any smaller and those individual pieces no longer retain all of the characteristics of life, and so I can't consider them individually as living things. Okay, so every organism is made up of at least one cell. We are organisms who are multicellular, so we are made up of more than one cell. Interesting, just little tidbit of information, it might take more than 700 plant cells to reach across a penny. So just to give you some context of how small a plant cell is, that's crazy, right? So 700 plant cells just to reach across from one end of the penny to the other. And those are actually eukaryotic cells. And so bacteria, there would be even more. They're even smaller than that. And keep in mind that every cell, in and of itself, both size and structure, is dictated by the way that it functions. So even if I look at different bacteria, their structures are a little different based on the jobs that they do in their ecosystem. I look in you, and you've got all sorts of different types of cells that make you up, from that cardiac muscle cell we just talked about in your heart, to the neuron in your brain, and their structure is specific to the job that they are supposed to be doing for the organism itself. And then there's still stuff smaller than that, right? Now this is where the characteristics of living things are all met, but there are still building pieces to those cells. So organelles, all right, these are the building pieces to that cell. So things like your mitochondria, which help produce energy, to your nucleus, which stores your genetic information, and all of those things also have their own job. So the nucleus happens to be your biggest one in your cell if your cell has it. All right, not every cell out there does contain a nucleus, and we'll talk about that a little later. But your nucleus as a whole, if we're talking about a cell that has one, typically is referred to as your control center, because this is where all of your instructions, if you want to think of it that way, are housed, and they're housed in, well, your DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. So this is a molecule, compound, otherwise known as DNA, and it is the chemical responsible for your inheritance. So you get half your genetic information from both parents, and that combination then works in your cells in different ways to tell that cell what to do as it functions on a daily basis, and when to do things, when not to do things, how to do different things, what molecules to create, when to create them. And we'll spend a decent amount of time in the spring talking specifically about how these processes all occur. And your DNA in and of itself is broken down into these units of hereditary information called genes. So you have a gene for eye color because that stretch of DNA gives your eyes the instructions to be blue or to be green. Your hair, same deal. You've got a gene for hair color. And because you inherited a certain set of DNA, a certain code, your body is told how to make your hair blonde or brunette or redhead, being a redhead. So they're all in these discrete little packages. Think of DNA as kind of being like your textbook, right? And so those genes are the individual chapters or even individual sections in each chapter that then give you information on how to study biology. Well, DNA kind of works the same way. If DNA collectively in your cells is the textbook, the genes then are those little pieces of information that help tell the cell how to function and what to do. So if I throw these guys all into a pyramid and sort of look at them as the base being the biggest or most encompassing, getting smaller as you go up, biosphere is going to be at the bottom. It's going to be the largest piece. It's going to be the most encompassing of everything above it. And each level of that pyramid as we go up gets a little bit smaller because it gets a little bit more specific, all the way up to things like atoms, and you could even throw protons, neutrons, and electrons all the way at the tippy top above that atom, being even smaller building blocks, subatomic building blocks for an atom.